Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. Actually, I guess it's now afternoon officially. We welcome, of course, those who are joining us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. For our guests here in-house, we would ask that courtesy to see that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off as we prepare to begin. And of course, we will post today's program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference as well. And our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. It's my privilege to welcome alumni of the Heritage Foundation to Heritage today. Stephen Mosher is an internationally recognized authority on China and population issues. He has worked for almost 4 decades now to fight coercive population control programs around the world. In 1979, he was the first American social scientist to visit mainland China, having been invited there by the Chinese government at that time. His visit and witnessing the enforcement of the regime's new one-child policy truly was a life-changing experience for him. Mr. Mosher has appeared numerous times before Congress as an expert in world population, China, and human rights abuses. He has also appeared on major national television networks and as a regular guest on television, talk radio, and other programs across the country. You may be familiar with some of his books. Among them are Broken Earth, The Rural Chinese, A Mother's Ordeal, One Woman's Fight Against China's One-Child Policy, and Hegemon, China's Plan to Dominate Asia and the World. Today, we are pleased to have him discuss his newest book, Bully of Asia, Why China's Dream is the New Threat to a World Order. Please join me in welcoming our good friend, Stephen Mosher. Stephen, thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. I think we had considerably more people signed up, but the snowflakes stayed home at the sight of a snowflake. I, on the other hand, flew up from Florida, where on a day like today, we would probably all prefer to be. I'm going to talk today on China, which is one of the only things I know anything about. As John said, I was the first American to arrive in China after the normalization of relations back in March of 1979, a long time ago now, more than half a lifetime. And I went to China as someone who is something of an admirer of the Maoist revolution, about which we could only admire because we knew so little about it. Being present in the operating room when government doctors, under the orders of government officials, were forcibly aborting women who were in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy was indeed a life-changing experience. Not just for them, of course, but for me as well. So I have followed events in China for 4 decades, and I am sad to say that things in China are not, unfortunately, turning out the way we had hoped they would turn out in the late 1970s, the early 1980s, even on to the late 1980s before the Tiananmen massacre. We were hopeful that China would gradually modernize, that it would democratize, that it would come to respect human rights, that economic freedom in China would lead to the creation of centers of influence, social and cultural influence at first, economic influence, and finally political influence. The rise of a middle class would lead to demands for more openness on the part of the Chinese government. All of that, of course, has gradually been shut down over the last 20, 25 years. And I'm afraid we're seeing what's happening in China is, as I say, sad. We're seeing China revert to type. Now, when I say revert to type, I mean to a type that has been prevalent in China for over 2,000 years. But let me begin by talking about the current world order. The subtitle of the book is Why China's Dream is the New Threat to World Order. And I really think that the People's Republic of China constitutes the only real threat to the current peaceful world order, largely peaceful world order, democratic world order that the United States has been the guarantor of since World War II. Now I'm going to see if this actually works here. Actually, a better question would be, do I actually know how to work it? And I do. So that's the subtitle of the book. Because, in fact, if you look around the world, there is only one country that constitutes a threat to the current world order. This is a country that, number one, long ago invented bureaucratic totalitarianism, which is to say the total subjection of the individual to the state, and still embraces a modified form of this all-embracing political tyranny today. Number two, only one country that produced its own high civilization, which it imagines surpasses anything the West or the rest of the world has to offer, that is persuaded by reason of this superior culture that it is owed universal deference, whose leaders govern an ethnic-based empire and tout the racial superiority of their race over all others. That concludes from its long centuries of regional hegemony that it has a natural right to once again bestride the region. One country whose humiliation, real or imagined at the hands of the West, has been used to foster a deep desire for revenge in everyone from the top leaders down to ordinary workers and students, that narcissistically dreams of a world under its hegemony, and that teaches its children to despise the United States for standing in the way of achieving this dream, that dismisses the current world order as fundamentally unjust, and thinks itself not only justified, but actually clever and sophisticated for deceiving its way to dominance, for example, by signing agreements that it has no intention of honoring. That believes, above all, that it is its manifest destiny to usher in a new world order, which it calls the world of great harmony. That even imagines in its hubris, and you see this in writings published now in the PRC, that this new world order will be greeted with joy by the peoples of the world. This country, of course, is the People's Republic of China. Now, if any of you are surprised by any of these assertions, you're not reading Chinese novels and the Chinese language press, which probably isn't surprising, because even at the CIA, they aren't reading the Chinese language press in the original language. I spoke at the CIA not long ago, and I had in the room probably most of the CIA's analysts who were watching China on a daily basis, various aspects of China, economic, cultural, political, and of course, above all, military. And I asked them how many of them were fluent in the language, and one lonely hand went up. So they were all getting their material, it turned out, from the Open Source Center, which is the agency of the U.S. government which does translations. It used to be called the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, FIBIS. My good friend Mike Pillsbury went over to the Open Source Center some time ago and talked to the people there who were doing the Chinese translations, and he said, you know, I've read some of your stuff, and it doesn't seem like you're translating all of the hate mail that is coming from China through its officially controlled media or through officially controlled websites. And the people of the Open Source Center who were doing the translation said, oh, we don't translate that because it's just repetitive. Well, it may be repetitive, but in the repetition there is truth. And the truth of the matter is that we now have, beginning in kindergarten in China and going on through college, we have a patriotic education program which teaches Chinese children that all of China's problems are a result of Western incursions into China beginning a century and a half ago, and that China has a natural right to recover its lost place in the world, and that the only thing that stands in the way of that happening is the United States. Now, this is if you want to call it poisoning the well, it certainly poisons the minds of a whole generation of young Chinese students, children, young adults now, who believe that all of China's problems in the world are caused by the United States. The patriotic education program, of course, was undertaken as a direct consequence of the Tiananmen demonstrations, where the Chinese Communist Party realized that it had lost the ideological battle for the hearts and minds of the Chinese young people. And as a result, of course, they've upped their ideological education program in this way. So, obviously, we have some misconceptions about China that we're dealing with here. Most American observers of China are laboring under a whole set of misperceptions of China, misperceptions that have prevented Americans from coming to grips with the actual reality, political, strategic, and geopolitical, that is China. Now, three major misperceptions. Misperception number one, China's political culture is communist. Misperception number two, China is a nation state. Misperception number three is that China's geopolitical goals are limited to its immediate neighborhood. So, anyone looking at China today with a background in the recent history of the West would say, of course China is communist. It's governed by a Chinese Communist Party. The fact is, however, that we have, predating communism by about 2,000 years, we have a legalist system of government. If you read ancient Chinese history, going back to the Warring States period, you will find that a school of thought called legalism grew up over 2,000 years ago. And legalism involved a number of traits that I think you'll find familiar. Political commissars in the military and the government, for example. People were not permitted to bear arms 2,000 years ago. A cult of personality, glorifying the emperor. A government propaganda corps that was established and traveled the length and breadth of China saying nice things about the government. Government censorship was set up. The persecution of dissidents. The burning of books that proposed other schools of thought. A secret police. Mutual surveillance and informer network. The purges of individuals with opposing worldviews at the time, 2,000 years ago, Confucian and other scholars. Concentration camps for people who disagreed with the government, who 2,000 years ago were building walls and digging canals. State control of important sectors of the economy. A highly centralized bureaucracy, obviously state domination over society. The ruler, the emperor, using the law as a penal tool to control the population. All of these innovations in statecraft, taken together, sound a lot like modern bureaucratic totalitarianism. They were actually invented in China over 2,000 years before that. So what we see in China today is not modern Marxist-Leninism, but the recrudescence of an ancient bureaucratic totalitarianism that dates back to the founding of China itself. So Western political theories concocted over the past couple hundred years do not capture both the essence or the depth of Chinese theories of government. Every country, of course, has its foundational myths and its foundational documents. We have the Pilgrims and Plymouth Rock. We have the covenant they signed, the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. We have a living extant political culture that dates back to the settlement of North America. We also have the notion that once we established our own Novus Ordo Seclorum, the new order of the ages, that previous political cultures would painlessly fade away. In the case of China, however, we find an ancient political culture that has survived down to the present day. Let me see if I can illustrate this by showing you. Okay, we've gone through that. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of the Qin dynasty. He's regarded as a hero in China by the current leaders because he defeated the other feudal states in China and unified China in 221 BC. And unity for China, for the Chinese people, is kind of a mystical concept that carries an enormous amount of weight. Of course, at the same time, Qin Shi Huangdi is regarded as a villain by Chinese Democrats and many others for creating the world's first bureaucratic totalitarian regime in order to do so. He is generally represented, and I skipped right through that, he is generally represented in the following fashion. There he is. A hero or villain, this is the traditional representation of Qin Shi Huangdi. He was referred to as Chairman Mao Zedong by Chairman Mao Zedong as our ancestral dragon, and he was in many ways Mao's role model. Now, we have in the West no contemporary example of an ancient civilization that survived intact to the present day. So it's hard for us to realize what happened in China. Um, so there we have China, the Qin dynasty, 210 BC. And it's the red area of the map. And of course, the dotted line represents the boundaries of modern China. And there we have the Roman Empire at its greatest extent, circa 100 AD. And this, of course, is the Roman Empire today. It doesn't exist. If the Roman Empire still existed, we would all know about the 12 tables of the law. We would know about the Constitution of the Roman Republic. We would be reading Polybius and Cicero. Every officer in the Roman army would have a copy of Marcus Aurelius's On Virtue. Instead, of course, today only General Mattis has a copy and reads it. That civilization, of course, ended with the fall of the Western, then the Eastern Roman Empire, and as a living extant political culture is no more. In the case of China, however, we find the opposite. We find an ancient civilization whose unique political culture has survived down to the present day. Just as China continues to use ideographs, hieroglyphics, we call them characters, ideographs, they're really the same thing, long after the West abandoned this way of writing. So China continues practices of governance that are devised well over 2,000 years ago. This means that the Chinese, because they still use characters, can read more or less easily the foundational text of their civilization. The Spring and Autumn Annals, for example, the writings of Confucius, the writings of the legalist Lisa and others. And we have the current Chinese Communist Party deliberately resurrecting this history of China. In the case, for example, of the mythical Yellow Emperor, has been seized upon as a historical cultural icon by the Chinese Communist Party to underline the racial unity of what is called in China the yellow race. And this is very interesting because it used to be thought that the Yellow Emperor was only the ancestor of all living Chinese, and I mean that in a genetic sense. But for political reasons, they have now expanded his genome to include the Mongols, the Manchus, the Tibetans, various other races that live within the borders of China, now claiming that the Yellow Emperor, the Chinese Communist Party now claims that the Yellow Emperor is the ancestor of virtually all of the peoples who live within the borders of modern-day China, which is an appeal, of course, to racial unity. So we talked about Qin Shi Huangdi, the founding emperor of the first Chinese dynasty, who is really China's George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, except he's not. He's the anti-George Washington. He's the anti-Abraham Lincoln. Because unlike Washington, Qin Shi Huangdi was eager for power and died in its pursuit. And unlike Abraham Lincoln, he enslaved the Chinese people instead of freeing them. This should be increasingly clear to everybody who studies China, because with every addition to political theory that we see in China today, beginning with the thought of Chairman Mao, and going on to Deng Xiaoping's additions, going on to Jiang Zemin's Three Represents, to Hu Jintao's Harmonious Socialist Society, and now to Xi Jinping's, the incorporation of Xi Jinping's thought into the Constitution of the People's Republic of China. We see that China is less and less Marxist-Leninist, less and less communist in the modern political sense, and more Chinese as China reverts increasingly to type. The official ideology, of course, of China is no longer communism. It is something called socialism with Chinese characteristics. The Chinese characteristics in question are an exaggerated view of the superiority of Chinese culture, of China's history, of the Chinese race as a corporate body, and the Chinese state itself. Taken as a whole, socialism with Chinese characteristics is really, socialism with narcissistic nationalism, or for short, we could call it National Socialism. Anybody who remembers the history of the last century will of course, resonate with the phrase National Socialism. Socialism with Chinese characteristics is National Socialism. So the governing ideology of China today is National Socialism, where the government does not directly control the economy, but it controls important sectors of the economy and it governs others, sometimes behind the curtain, sometimes by doing what it has now done to WeChat and the other social media platforms. It has said, we, the government, want to own 1% of your company, and we want to have a seat on the board. And of course, if you're the Chinese Communist Party and you own 1% of a company and have a seat on the board, that means you have effective veto power over what the company does or doesn't do. So this is sort of the way that the National Socialists in Germany, for example, or the fascists in Italy behaved. They didn't control the corporations directly, but they had party members on the boards, and they insisted that the companies produce goods that on demand by the government. So Xi Jinping is an interesting figure because he's not just the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party or the President of the People's Republic of China. He's now the leader of a dozen different leading groups, as they're called, little groups managing national security, the economy, everything you can think of. All roads lead to Xi. Some of you may have seen that he held major military exercises last week in which he appeared wearing a military uniform. Now, he's entitled to wear such a uniform. He's the chairman of the Central Military Commission. But can you think of another major leader around the world who dresses up in a military uniform and walks around as kind of a generalissimo, watching maneuvers by his troops? I don't even recall Kim Jong-un, Little Rocket Man in North Korea, doing that. In fact, I don't recall any Western leader doing that since Mussolini. So it is a strikingly, for me, it's a strikingly militaristic portrait of the new leader of China. President Trump, who is apparently not afraid to say what he means under any and all circumstances, diplomatic niceties and political correctness be damned, has called Xi Jinping the King of China, which I thought was very interesting because it cuts right to the heart of the matter. Of course, kings in China disappeared when Qin Shi Huangdi conquered China. The last kings were eliminated. And since then in China, we've had emperors. Mao Zedong was called, with no exaggeration, a red emperor. I think what we have in Xi Jinping is a new red emperor who's modeling himself on Mao Zedong, and in turn modeled himself on the founding emperor of the Qin dynasty, Qin Shi Huang. So what I've tried to do here is just connect in your minds what is going on today in China with what happened in China 2,000 years ago. And Americans who are in love with modernity, who have, in general, this crowd, of course, not included, who have a very shallow view of history, find it hard to imagine that events that happened thousands of years ago could have any relevance at all for what's happening today. But in China, they do. Those ancient texts are read. Those ancient leaders are studied. Their stratagems are in play in China each and every day. And the worldview that developed in China 2,000 years ago is, I would argue, the worldview that the governing worldview of the party state elite in China today. It's a very different world, of course, that China finds itself in. But China wants to interact with that world in the same way that it has throughout history, as the Middle Kingdom, as the kingdom at the center of the earth, to which other countries are either tributary states to the Middle Kingdom, or they're enemies of the Middle Kingdom. And China is not a nation state. Nation states acknowledge that other nation states are equivalent political corporate entities. I do not believe that the Chinese leadership in its heart of hearts thinks of, say, Singapore or Vietnam or any one of the other countries that surrounds China as an equivalent of political corporate entity. In fact, when the Chinese minister was meeting with a group of ASEAN leaders, and the Singaporean foreign minister a couple of years ago made a remark about China's aggressive behavior in the South China Sea. The Chinese foreign minister responded, "You have to understand, China's a big country, and you are a little country, and that's just a fact." Again, so China does not regard itself as being surrounded by equal and equivalent nation states. It is an empire that has survived into the modern day, and empires do not have natural borders. The borders of empires are set by force and can fluctuate. China's geopolitical goals are therefore not limited to East Asia. The reign of the emperor in traditional China was theoretically infinite. There was actually, during Xi Jinping's long, 3.5-hour speech to the 19th Party Congress, which fit the pattern established by Mao Zedong, who famously said, we shouldn't hold long meetings, right? 会议不要开太长. And what he meant by that was, when I'm done speaking, we're done. You can all go home because nobody else is worth listening to. So Xi Jinping utterly dominated the Party Congress. During the course of his remarks, he also talked about the last 300 years as being anomalous in terms of relations between countries. And it is interesting that the Treaty of Westphalia, which goes back about 350 years, which recognized the equivalence of states large and small in the West, I think that was an oblique reference too. So we find ourselves, again, unfortunately, in the midst of a long twilight struggle with a National Socialist adversary which rejects the very principles on which the current world order rests. It rejects the idea of popular sovereignty. It rejects Western notions of human rights. It rejects the idea that nation states governed by a fixed, immutable set of rules are equal, and one whose grand strategy is one of governing tianxia, which means all under heaven, and which longs for a shijie datong, a world of great harmony. Now you might say, okay, fine. It really doesn't matter how China views itself, because China exists now in a world of nation states, whether it likes it or not, and nation states that will constrain it. Of course, there is a school of thought which believes that China will still, if we make a sufficient number of concessions, simply join the existing world order. I do not think that is likely. I think it has become increasingly clear in the last few years that China is not interested in joining the existing world order, but in fundamentally transforming it. And you see that the face of the Chinese party state's aggressive nationalism in things like declaring, when the Hague Tribunal declared that China's seizure of the South China Sea was a violation of international law. The new Red Emperor, Xi Jinping, declared that decision was waste paper. Waste paper. Not very long ago, the people of Hong Kong rose up in some number and demanded that the basic law, which was signed between Great Britain and the People's Republic of China some 20 years ago, be adhered to, and that the members of the Legislative Council in this last year, 2017, be all democratically elected by the local population. And the Chinese spokesman said that the basic law is merely now a matter of historical interest. That is to say, it has some historical relevance, but no relevance for the present day. The basic law was supposed to be in effect for 50 years. So again, we see China basically, when it gets to a point where it believes it is strong enough to ignore covenants and agreements that it has agreed to abide by, it simply tears them up. So what does all this mean? I mean, you know, this again would only be relevant to China if China's ambitions were merely a matter of national fantasy. I mean, is regional hegemony, global hegemony, an impossible dream? for China. I've had an argument with the University of Chicago's John Mearsheimer about this because Professor Mearsheimer believes that, quote, it is almost impossible for any state to achieve global hegemony because it is too hard to project and sustain power around the world and onto the territory of distant great powers. And he goes on to say there's simply too much landmass to traverse and too many oceans to cross for any country. These constitute great walls and giant moats containing a state's hegemonic ambitions to the region where it is located. So the best outcome that a state can hope for is to be a regional hegemon and thus dominate its own geographical area while seeking to prevent other great powers in other regions from duplicating their feat. Now that was actually the national security policy of the first Bush administration, which following the collapse of the Soviet Union said it is our policy rather, to prevent other great powers from dominating other regions. And that's the experience of the United States, right? The United States, once the U.S. had established regional hegemony over the Western Hemisphere in the late 1800s, it acted to constrain other great powers to ensure that no other rival great power was able to dominate its own region in the same way. You know, even in the aftermath of World War II, when the United States had an astonishing 50% of the world's GDP, as the rest of the industrialized world was destroyed by war, it did not attempt to utterly dominate the world. Now, our hesitation to engage in that kind of domination, to engage in territorial expansion, owes its existence in part, I think, to our democratic ideals, but it also is a function of our unique geography, because we have, in North America, vast stretches of ocean separating the Americas from the rest of the world. So we do have giant moats in the Atlantic and Pacific, natural defensive barriers that serve to dissuade other great powers from trying to project power onto our shores and prevent us from immediately intervening overseas. But China has no such moats. China's strategy is not dictated by geography the way the United States strategy is. America's best course of action after becoming the regional hegemon is to try and prevent any other great power from dominating the eastern or western ends of the Eurasian continent. But China sits at the eastern terminus of the world island, as it has been called, and China has other options. And this is Mackinder's, Halford Mackinder in 1904 published his Heartland theory, which said basically he who rules East Europe commands the heartland, who rules the heartland commands the world island, who rules the world island commands the world. Obviously, I think he got it wrong. China has always considered itself to be the heartland of East Asia. And the same Chinese party state that rules the heartland is busily positioning itself to one day command the world island as well. I think we need to be paying a lot more attention to that. So I think China's grand strategy, just as America's grand strategy is presupposed by its geography, so is China's. Although the states of the Pacific Rim are within easy reach of China, beyond them lie the vast reaches of the Pacific Ocean, the Middle Kingdom's own giant moat. To the west, however, the Chinese party state suffers no such geographical constraint. The deserts and mountains that in earlier times proved such sturdy barriers to expansion have been reduced by modern transport to mere sandlots and foothills. A round trip along the ancient Silk Road 2,000 years ago between the Roman Empire and China took about 2 years. The new Silk Road, announced by Xi Jinping, already features weekly rail freight service between Shanghai and London. And $1.5 trillion in Chinese-built infrastructure will follow in the next few years. The new Silk Road is intended to do more than just facilitate trade. The larger strategic goal is to remake the map of the global economy to put China at its center, drawing not just Central Asia, but Europe, the Middle East, into China's orbit. And we have quotes from many people in China, from Xi Jinping on down. Minister of Commerce Fang says the new Silk Road is intended to rebalance the global economy. Rebalance it in what? And in what sense? To rebalance it around China. So China watchers who remain convinced that China's ambitions do not extend beyond its region should take a close look at the map of the new Silk Road. It includes rail lines, ports, power plants, and roads that will one day crisscross Eurasia, and I think it indicates a larger strategic objective. So, before anyone dismisses out of hand the possibility of China gaining a commanding position on the world island, that is Eurasia, recall that this was pretty much accomplished 800 years ago from the back of a galloping horse. The Mongol horse archers, starting from the steppes of Central Asia, conquered everything from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. The Chinese party state, unlike previous dynasties of China, has now Sinicized the Mongol dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, as well as the Manchu dynasty, the Qing dynasty. It considers them to be Chinese dynasties. It has now appropriated both the empire of the great Khans and, in fact, the ethnicity of the great Khans to be its own. Remember, the mythical Yellow Emperor is said now to be the progenitor of not just the Chinese, but the Mongols and the Manchus as well. Does the historical map of the Mongol Empire, the largest empire the world has ever seen, justify a desire among the China dreamers to expand westward? Given China's propensity to use ancient maps to justify modern borders, it would be surprising if it didn't. Of course, we have a concocted map of China's dominion of the South China Sea used to assert sovereignty over the entire South China Sea. And we have other maps in China which are used to assert territorial claims which are really made up out of whole cloth. So why couldn't modern China, why wouldn't the Chinese party state be thinking of moving westward over the old Silk Road? Not by embarking upon a campaign of military conquest, of course, but by slow economic absorption and political encroachment through the New Silk Road Initiative. Much of the area in Central Asia is ruled by corrupt elites, sparsely populated, and so could be drawn into China's orbit with relative ease. I think that process is already underway. Each of those countries also has a large population of Chinese expatriates, usually young, unattached males who are part of the Guangun, the bachelors who have been created by the one-child policy. The one-child policy has disproportionately, of course, eliminated little girls from China's population, and so you've got tens of millions of young men who cannot get married and are looking, in some cases, for opportunities overseas in neighboring countries. So if China were able to dominate much of Central Asia and parts westward, China would not technically be a global hegemon, but it would control a region so vast that it would probably be by far the most powerful state on the planet. If the slow dissolution of the European Union continues, it will provide China with other opportunities to do the same thing. A Eurasia dominated in large part by the Chinese party state would be problematic for America, but the reverse is not true. I mean, it's largely irrelevant to Beijing's plans whether the U.S. continues to dominate the Americas or not, since this doesn't interfere with its main chance, which is to construct an economic empire across as much of the 9,000-mile width of the Eurasian continent as it can, extracting resources there to run its fuel, its giant industrial machine, while dominating its markets with its products. I think that alone would guarantee China's primacy, almost regardless of America's continued economic and military strength. China doesn't have to convince a single country in the Western Hemisphere, or even the countries of the Pacific Rim, to ally with it in order to succeed with this strategy. We, on the other hand, must exert ourselves to retain our position on the Pacific Rim and on the world island itself. Eurasia, of course, has a population, total population of about 4 billion people, well over half the number of people on the planet. So all this is to say that China has an innate advantage in the great game of the 21st century. While the world island will never be America's, it could well be China's. So what do we do about this possibility? Well, I think the first thing we do is we become a lot more serious about understanding exactly how China sees itself. The misperceptions that surround China should be brought to the light of day. We need to understand how the Chinese party state conceives itself, what political heritage it is heir to, and what its grand strategy is. Those who claim that China has no grand strategy are simply failing to look at Chinese history, because Chinese history screams out to us in dynasty after dynasty exactly what China's grand strategy is. There are a number of things that we can do and should do. First of all, of course, is to dramatically increase the number of people that we have following events in China. We need to bolster the number of China hands we have on duty and make them fluent in the Chinese language instead of having them deal in secondary sources. I think we need trade that's not only free but fair. I think President Trump called Xi Jinping a couple days ago and said the current trading relationship is unsustainable. It certainly is. We can't allow the hemorrhaging of U.S. Economic strength to continue to occur. I think we have to clearly do what Japan does. If you look at the trading relationship between Japan and China, it's very interesting because the trade is always relatively in balance. Japan sells about as much to China as it imports. And the reason that is the case is because when the trade gets out of balance, the ministers of trade meet and work out a deal to bring it back into balance. And there will have to be some sort of intervention in order to bring the trade back into balance between China and the United States. We have to understand that North Korea is China. North Korea is China. The road to solving the North Korean problem does not run through military action. It runs through Beijing. North Korea would cease to exist were it not for the support it receives from the People's Republic of China. I think everybody knows that. We may pretend otherwise at our peril, but the missiles that Little Rocket Man launches are assembled from components that are made in China. Maybe the rocket motors come from Russia, but a lot of the other electronic components, the valves, even the material made to make the skin of the rocket comes from China itself. So if you want to shut down the nuclear program and the missile program, you go to China, you go to Xi Jinping, who can shut it down. And of course, I think the other thing you do is you play the Taiwan card. If China can take rocks in the South China Sea and sandbars in the South China Sea and coral reefs in the South China Sea, which in many cases are submerged at high tide, and pour thousands of tons of concrete on top of them, dredging up tens of thousands of tons of sand, killing the coral reefs in the process, and build naval and air bases in the South China Sea, then certainly we can help another much larger island bolster its defenses as well. Beijing, of course, will be unhappy if we become, I think, more clear-eyed about its intentions. Beijing will be unhappy if we insist that trade be conducted on a fair basis. Beijing will be unhappy if we say they're already unhappy when we tell them that North Korea is a problem they've created and they should solve. They will be very unhappy if we continue to sell arms to Taiwan, or if, for example, we allow U.S. naval vessels to make port calls in Taiwan, or if we help Taiwan develop a submarine force, or if we engage in joint exercises with the Navy on Taiwan. They will be unhappy. But the fact is, our very existence makes them unhappy. You cannot placate a country which is implacable, because the only thing I think that would placate China would be for the United States to disappear as a world power. As long as we are the benign superpower that we are, promoting democracy and human rights and freedom around the world, we will be China's enemy, because they promote the opposite. And I want to say, too, in conclusion, that if China were a free market democracy, as I think it had a chance of being 70 or 80 years ago, as I think it may one day have a chance of being again, we would welcome China's rise. We would welcome China to join the existing world order and respect widely recognized universal human rights, and hold free and democratic elections, as have been held on Taiwan now for the last 20 years. But China, unfortunately, is not a free market democracy, and if China's world of great harmony comes to pass under the current party-state rule, China will be a world that is less free, less democratic, and less respectful of human rights, and less pleasant to live in, I think, for all of us, not least for the Chinese people themselves. Thank you. Now, I've talked for a long time, and now is your chance to ask any questions that you may have. Yes, sir.
Historically, military power is integrally tied to industrial capacity, technological advances, from the stirrup to gunpowder to artillery. And certainly 50% of the world's GNP that we produced in World War II was undoubtedly what won World War II. Now our trade policy is such that, we've just deindustrialized. Our trade situation with China, our lead export item is agriculture. Our second one is scrap, whereas all the high-tech stuff is coming from China. So it seems to me that the urgency with China is to reindustrialize, to reclaim our manufacturing, rebuild our technology. Would you not agree that's really the first thing we have to do?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's no question that without a robust industrial base, you can't field all the kind of weapons you need to maintain your place in the world. I think the United States still has a lot of natural advantages in terms of resources, in terms of if we do renew our infrastructure, we will have advantages in transportation. We have an advantage in a free and open labor market. China does have disadvantages, significant disadvantages. China has, because of the one-child policy, put in place a demographic trap for itself. 2 years ago, for the first time, the PRC had a labor shortage of some 4 million people. That labor shortage will grow more severe over time because they've eliminated 400 million of their population because of the one-child policy. They also have, I think, a looming debt crisis. Much of the debt is off the books, consists of soft loans by local governments to various entities which are probably related by some sort of corrupt ties to local officials. Those loans will probably never be paid off. But is it China's policy to do what Morgenthau, our Secretary of the Treasury, advocated after World War II to Germany? The Morgenthau Plan was to deindustrialize Germany, return it to an agricultural state, after which he said it will no longer be able to make panzers and other weapons and will cease to be a threat to the peace of Europe and the world. And I think China's policy also bears more than a passing resemblance to Japan's policy. After the Sino-Japanese War in 1895, when Japan occupied Taiwan, its policy was consciously to industrialize Japan, right, and to agriculturalize Taiwan, right? 工业日本, 农业台湾. And so in Taiwan, the Taiwanese were supposed to busy themselves producing rice and sugarcane. And so the only factories that were allowed to exist were those that processed rice and turned sugarcane into sugar. I think China would like to do that, not just with regard to the United States. I think it would like to move the world's industrial base as a whole to China and use the rest of the world as a source of raw materials, agricultural products, and a market for its industrialized goods. And it is willing to do anything to make that happen. I think everyone by now should be perfectly clear that in China, they have adopted our phrase that we use over and over again in negotiations. We say we want a win-win agreement. We want an agreement that benefits China, and we want an agreement that benefits the United States. And the Chinese negotiators smile and nod and say, oh yes, win-win. In China, win-win is a joke. Win-win means the first win is that you win in the negotiations because you, China, say, we're just a poor developing country. We need favorable terms. You need to bend over backwards to help make this deal work. And the second win is when they cheat on the agreement. And so that's what win-win means in China. So well known in China, it's a national joke. We just have to be a lot more sophisticated in understanding that simply having an agreement in writing with this particular government, which changes its constitution on a I mean, the fundamental document, right, the governing document of a country is supposed to be its constitution. And a constitution is supposed to be not a living document, but something which is a written guarantee of the relationship between a government and its people. The constitution of the PRC is rewritten every few years to accord with the sentiments of the current leadership. In the same way, the written word in contracts is not regarded as sacrosanct. So we could talk about the theft of intellectual property. We could talk about the ongoing cyber war against the United States. The other thing people need to bear in mind, which has been largely forgotten, is that when the Soviet Union fell in 1991, Deng Xiaoping said to his senior comrades that the old Cold War is over. The United States won, the Soviet Union lost. The new Cold War has now begun, and China will win this one. As reported by Samuel Huntington in the pages of Foreign Affairs in 1993. And again in his book, The Clash of Civilizations. We need to remember that China has been in a Cold War with us for 26 years. And I don't like the idea of being in a Cold War. I mean, I remember crawling under my desk in elementary school, you know, practicing what we would do in the event of a nuclear strike by Russia as if a half an inch of wood is going to protect us against the blast. But the fact is, if your adversary says you're at war, then you're probably at war whether you want to be or not. So you might as well deal with it. Yes, sir.
My name is Samar Chatterjee, Safe Foundation. You mentioned in China there's a lot of hate writing about the United States. And of course, your book does the reverse. You're doing the American hate writing against the Chinese. And now the question is, where were you when Henry Kissinger was facilitating the trip of Richard Nixon to China? And I think I was born in India, so Indian experts and others advised him not to do that. However, he went on. So, and since then, all the American presidents have been doing tango with the Chinese presidents and Chinese leaders. And your relationship with China has deepened to an extent that now they can really undermine, even financially, without even firing a shot, American economy. So given that, where were you and why didn't you do something then?
Well, where was I? In 1972, I was a young naval officer on the USS Hector and later on the USS Lockwood, and I was the engineer on the last U.S. ship to drop anchor in Kaohsiung Harbor in 1994. So I wasn't involved in China at all, although I would like to be there when the first American, when the first U.S. Navy ship drops anchor in Kaohsiung Harbor again, because I think we should be making port calls in Taiwan, especially because we have now been denied the right to make port calls in Hong Kong on 2 separate occasions. So there's a justification for that. When Nixon came back from China, he is reported to have said to Henry Kissinger, I may have created a monster. Well, I think it's pretty clear that the monster is alive and devouring entire seas now, speaking of the South China Sea. What we've seen over the last few decades is the largest transfer of wealth in human history from the United States to China. And it has been done in broad daylight, in large part. I mean, it's been done in secret in part, but in large part it's been done with the support and the connivance of U.S. officials currently serving and not currently serving, but serving U.S. officials and former U.S. officials like Henry Kissinger, who for years led trade delegations to China and helped to foster the U.S.-China trade to America's disadvantage. I think he's now seen the error of his ways. We labored. Look, back in 1989, with the Tiananmen massacre and the killing of thousands of unarmed students in the streets of the capital city of the People's Republic of China, it should have been obvious to anybody that our efforts to fundamentally transform China by encouraging its peaceful evolution into a democratic state that respected human rights had fallen on hard times. Okay, I was on the commission that set up Radio Free Asia in 1991. And the first thing, and we thought at the time that if we could simply bypass the government's monopoly on news and information about events in China itself, bypass that and provide news and information about what was happening in China, the labor unrest, the additional student demonstrations, the mistreatment of dissidents, the mistreatment of Tibetans, you name it, the list goes on and on, that the Chinese people eventually in their righteous anger would rise up and we would see, again, the peaceful evolution of China. I think that ship has sailed a long time ago. I think until this present administration, every administration has labored under the delusion that we were going to see China fundamentally transformed into a country that, if not completely democratic, at least would have learned to live within the rules of the existing world order. That is clearly not happening. I don't think it's too late. I think we have a limited amount of time, however, to get it right from this point forward. And there are encouraging things, I think, happening in our relationship with China, in the sense that we seem to be getting serious about the trade imbalance. We have put considerable pressure on not just North Korea, but China in order to deal with North Korea cutting off access to the international financial system by the Bank of Dandong and some other Chinese organizations that sell parts and pieces of missiles to North Korea. But there's a lot more. There's a lot more that needs to be done, and time is running out. I think right now we have a Chinese military buildup right in the Dokkan Peninsula, the Dokkan Plateau in Bhutan. And again, 6 months ago, there was a confrontation, and both sides agreed to withdraw, except the Chinese didn't withdraw. So I think there's a pattern there that we need to be aware of. So the idea, the pleasant fantasy that China, if we would just give China time, it was going to become just like us, has proven to be a fallacy. Well, we had, look, until the last year, we had an administration, the head of which said that kept saying, President Obama was fond of saying, we have more to fear from a weakened, threatened China than we have to fear from a powerful, economically prosperous one. And I actually think that most people would much prefer dealing with a weakened, threatened China than a powerful, prosperous, aggressive one. So anyway, hopefully we're beyond that now, and we can begin to move forward in the Indo-Pacific and unite with other countries which share our democratic values and institutions, and constrain some of the aggressive actions of this destabilizing actor. John tells me I have time for 2 more questions. Yes, sir. You're in the front row? Yeah.
Hello, John. I'm from Radio Free Asia, and I want to ask you that you just compare China to a lot of our ancient dynasties, and I want to know that, so every dynasties have their start and end. So you think that the current China, would that be an end soon or any time later, and what would be the reason for that? Thank you.
Well, first let me say that just because he's from Radio Free Asia, I didn't plant this question, okay? Secondly, you know, prophets have short, unhappy lives in general, so I am not going to prophesy about when the current dynasty might end. My point, of course, was that that history in China is very important, and that the views that dominated China 2,000 years ago are the views that have come to the fore today. You know, we hear a lot about China's inventions of different things, of gunpowder and the compass and so forth. But it is China's innovations in statecraft, which came about over 2,200, 300, 500 years ago, which ultimately may have the most impact on human life on planet Earth. Obviously, their innovations in bureaucratic totalitarianism predated those of Marx and Lenin by over 2,000 years. And I'm afraid what we're seeing in China today is a digital dictatorship. We used to, when we used to talk about totalitarianism, some people would object and say, well, it's impossible for a bureaucratic totalitarian state to exercise total control over its people. The idea is just nonsense. I mean, 1984 would never happen. Brave New World is just a fantasy. Well, now we have electronic devices with microphones and cameras, and we have a digital dictatorship well on the way of being constructed in China, where everybody will have a social credit score. And if someone in China talks to you, their social credit score will go down. And if someone in China says something positive about the Chinese Communist Party, their social credit score will go up. And if you've got a low social credit score, you can't get a visa to exit the country, you can't get a passport, you can't get a ticket on an airline, you can't get a first-class ticket on a train, you can't get a low-interest rate loan, all sorts of bad things happen. So we are now, I think, in a race for time in China. Are the Chinese people going to become prosperous and educated enough to demand a more open society to live in? Or is the Chinese party state going to master the new digital information age technology they need to control almost the very thoughts of people? If you can be checking in real time what they're texting and tweeting and what they're saying on Facebook, you're inside the minds of individuals. You don't have to wait until, in the Manchu dynasty, the rule was that no more than 10 officials could gather together at any given time. It was illegal for more than 10 Chinese officials to meet because the Manchus in charge of the Qing dynasty were convinced that if more than 10 Chinese officials met, they would be plotting rebellion against the dynasty. So there were controls then, but now the controls are ever so much more fine and controlling. I think it's very important what the United States does in this context. I think that if we get serious about checking China, if we get serious about stopping the transfer of intellectual property, if we try to get our trade relations back in balance, if we find a way to combat the ongoing cyber war against government and private computer networks, if we do these things, we're going to slow down China's economic advance. We're going to bring to a head, I think, the various crises that are brewing in China, and that will have a salutary outcome. So we will have a lot to do with what happens in China in the future. I think I've used up all my time. One more? Okay. Yes, sir.
Do you think that China's fundamental issues that you mentioned maybe a few minutes ago, such as the aging population, shortage of labor, massive debts in the economy, would mitigate or even neutralize its ambitions whatsoever? Do you believe that, or do you think they can override those challenges?
Well, I think the debt crisis is obviously being dealt with by using the surplus from trade with not just the United States, but with other countries in the world. And if that trade surplus were to wind down, I think the debt crises would come to a head very quickly. There are some economists who believe that since the debt is owed by state-owned companies, in large part to state-owned banks, that they can simply write off the debt with no economic consequences. I think that's the equivalent of an economic perpetual motion machine. I don't think that's true. That the debt 300%, it's impossible to know exactly how much the debt is, but it's far greater than the public debt, at least of the United States. So again, thank you all for coming, and I will be around for a few more minutes for any of those of you who didn't have a chance to ask your questions. And I think there are a few more books out front that the Heritage Foundation has ordered and is selling. You want to buy them?
Do your own best.
Thanks again.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for giving my closing remarks. We do have copies available in the foyer, as well as refreshments for those who would like to stay. And since you've committed to taking any questions up here, I'm sure they'll be glad to join you at this podium. Thank you again for your kind attention.